The rain came down that October night as if it had been saving itself for months, and perhaps it had, because the ford below Ashford Hall had not run so high in a decade, and the man now attempting to cross it on horseback had not, until approximately 4 minutes earlier, considered himself the sort of duke who ended an evening face down in a hedge. He would consider it after tonight. He would consider a great many things after tonight, chiefly a small cottage with a crooked chimney and a goose of startling moral authority, but that came later. First came the water, and the horse's understandable objection to it, and the mud, which received the Duke of Ashford with the impartial hospitality mud offers everyone, dukes included. He had not smiled, properly smiled, the kind that reaches past the mouth and does something to the whole face, in 3 years. Some of the older tenants said 4, but they were the same tenants who insisted the roof of the east wing had always been that colour, so their testimony on matters of duration was suspect. What was not suspect was the fact itself. Julian Ashford, 9th Duke of Ashford, had buried his wife on a Tuesday in a spring that felt in memory entirely grey, and had since conducted his face like a ledger kept for auditors who never came. He was 31 years old. He ran an estate of considerable size, with a precision that other men called admirable, and his own grandmother called a symptom. 1.5 miles away, in a cottage with one crooked chimney and a garden given over more to usefulness than to beauty, a young woman named Clementine Hale was laughing at a goose. The goose, whose name was Diogenes, and who had never in his life apologized for anything, had upended a basin of wash water directly into his own face while attempting to intimidate it, and was now standing in a posture of wounded dignity that would have moved a lesser audience to pity. Clementine was not a lesser audience. She laughed the way she did most things, without asking anyone's permission first, a short, real, surprised sound, gone as quickly as it came. The kind of laugh that had never once been performed for an audience, because until that moment there had never been one. Nothing about that winter went as either of them planned, but first the door had to be knocked upon, and the goose had to weigh in, and a man who had not meant to fall in love with anyone ever again had to be pulled, quite literally, out of a hedge. Let us begin properly, and go back an hour. The knock came at 9:30, 3 sharp raps, and then a 4th that arrived late, as though the hand delivering it had reconsidered its own strength halfway through. Clementine set down her mending. She had been letting out the hem of Mrs. Tovey's second-best dress, a task requiring patience and a candle she could not entirely spare, and went to the door with the unhurried competence of a woman who had opened it to worse things than weather. She had opened it to a fox once. She had opened it to a magistrate. She was not, on the whole, alarmed by knocking. She was, however, mildly alarmed by what stood on the other side, which was a man soaked through to a degree that suggested the rain had taken it personally, mud to the knee, hatless, his dark hair plastered flat, and his hand braced against her doorframe, as though the doorframe were the only thing currently keeping the world level. "I've lost my horse," he said. It was, of all the sentences available to him, not the one a duke usually leads with. But he was not thinking of himself, at that moment, as a duke. He was thinking of himself as a man who had lost his horse. "That is unfortunate for the horse," Clementine said, "who will have to find its own way home, and rather more fortunate for you, who has found a door." She stepped back to let him in before he could object, because objecting was clearly the direction he was leaning, some old training in him insisting that gentlemen did not fall into strangers' cottages and drip on their floors. Sit before you fall down. You're no good to anyone horizontal. I am not in the habit of falling down. No one ever is, until the evening they do. He looked at her for a moment longer than the sentence required. It was the first thing he registered about her. Though he would not have been able to say so aloud that night, or for some weeks afterward, she had looked directly at him, unhurried, unafraid, the way one looks at weather rather than at a stranger who might be dangerous. Most people, on first meeting a man they did not know, arriving soaked and wild-eyed at their door at 9:30, performed some version of alarm, because alarm was the polite thing to perform. She had not performed anything. She had simply assessed him, the way she might assess a fence in want of mending, and gotten on with the business of the evening. Diogenes the goose, roused by the draught, came around the corner of the hearth and delivered his opinion at once, which was to advance upon the stranger's boot and bite it with the solemnity of a magistrate reading a verdict. Diogenes, Clementine said, in the tone of a woman long past being surprised by her own goose, that is a guest. He disagrees, the stranger said, looking down at the goose with an expression of genuine scholarly interest, as though he had encountered a new species of weather. He disagrees with everyone, on principle, for the first 10 minutes. After that he generally comes around. She was already moving toward the hearth, banking the fire higher, reaching for the kettle, and if he noticed that she had not asked his name, he did not remark on it, because she had not asked because she was too busy deciding what to feed him. Sit there, by the fire, before you catch your death, and I have to explain a strange dead man to the constable. I would rather not require an explanation. Then sit. He sat. It was, she would think much later, the first thing that told her anything true about him, that a man who plainly gave orders for a living had simply done as he was told, without argument, the moment the order made sense. She found him dry linen, her father's old shirt, kept for reasons she did not examine too closely, soft with age, and a blanket her grandmother had woven 40 years before. A patched, faded, entirely unglamorous thing in 3 shades of blue that had outlasted 2 houses and 1 flood already. She put a chipped robin's egg cup into his hands, tea steeped strong enough to stand a spoon in, and said, "Drink that before you speak again. You sound like a man narrating his own obituary. I nearly was one. The ford took my horse's footing and very nearly took mine. Then you may thank the hedge, which I understand broke your fall, and which will expect nothing from you but your continued existence." She sat opposite him, mending forgotten, and studied him over the rim of her own cup with the same unhurried directness. "You've a fine coat, under all that mud. Or you had one. I had rather more than a coat, this morning. Most of us do," she said, "before the day gets its hands on us." And something in the way she said it, plain, unbothered, offering no pity and asking for none, made him look at her again, longer this time, and think with the small guilty jolt of a man catching himself doing arithmetic he had sworn off, "That is the first person in 3 years who has looked at me and seen a man soaked to the knee. And nothing else." He gave her a name that was not, strictly, a lie, because it was his mother's family name and he had answered to it as a boy, Vane. Mist Vane, he told her, new to the district, come out to look at flood damage for the estate, and thrown from his horse for his trouble. It was not the whole truth, he told himself, settling into the warmth of her fire, and the frankly excellent tea, that it was not a lie either, only an omission, the kind any sensible man made with a stranger at 9:30. He did not examine this reasoning very closely. Reasoning of that kind rarely survives close examination, which is precisely why men in his position so seldom attempt it. She fed him bread and a wedge of cheese sharp enough to argue with, and she talked, easily, about the flood and the goose and Mrs. Tovey's hem, filling the room with the kind of ordinary conversation he had not realised, until its absence was remedied, that he had been starving for. He answered in short sentences. He found himself, somewhere in the second cup of tea, telling her a small true thing about the estate's tenants that Mr. Vane, new to the district, could not possibly have known, and catching himself and covering it, badly, and being let off the hook by her apparent lack of interest in cross-examining him. "You ask very few questions," he said, "for a woman who has just taken a stranger into her home. I ask the ones that matter. Are you dangerous? No. Are you hungry? Less so. Now. Then the rest can wait for morning," she said, "when you are drier and I am less tired, and we can decide together whether you are interesting enough to bother asking about." She said it with a smile that was not quite a laugh, but was clearly its close relation, and he found, sitting there in her dead father's shirt, with her grandmother's blanket around his shoulders, that some frozen mechanism in his chest had shifted very slightly, the way ice shifts before it thinks better of it and refreezes. He left before dawn, while she slept, because some instinct told him that a duke discovered in a cottage at sunrise would require explanations neither of them was prepared to give, and because he told himself, walking the 1.5 miles back through mud that had not improved overnight, that the visit had been an accident with no sequel. He told himself this with great conviction. He continued to tell himself this for approximately 3 days, which was exactly as long as it took him to invent a reason to go back. The reason, when it arrived in the shape of her roof. It was not, strictly, in disrepair. It had survived the storm rather better than his own dignity had, but a duke who has spent 3 years auditing his own face for signs of feeling has a well-practised talent for constructing plausible administrative reasons, and by Thursday Julian Ashford had convinced himself, with the earnest thoroughness of a man building a case for a jury of one, that the flood had likely loosened her thatch, that a responsible estate looked after its outlying cottages, and that Mr. Vane, new under steward, would be entirely within his professional remit to go and check. He told his valet he required his plainest coat. His valet, a man named Fenwick, who had served the house for 26 years and had opinions he expressed exclusively through the left side of his face, raised one eyebrow by what a household maid later measured, with a ruler, at approximately 2 millimetres, and said nothing at all, which was, from Fenwick, the loudest possible commentary. Clementine was up a ladder inspecting her own thatch when he arrived, which rather undercut the premise of his visit before he had finished dismounting. "Mr. Vane," she called down, not remotely surprised, "come to inspect a roof I have already inspected. 2 inspections are more thorough than 1. 2 inspections are what a man performs," she said, climbing down with the unhurried competence he was already beginning to recognise as characteristic of her, when he has run out of better reasons and hasn't yet admitted it to himself. She dusted straw from her skirt. Diogenes emerged from behind the water butt, regarded the visitor with the studied neutrality of a magistrate reserving judgment pending further evidence, and did not bite him, which both of them understood to be a significant development. "I've brought back your blanket," he said, producing it, freshly laundered, folded with a precision that suggested he did not often fold his own linen, but had insisted on doing so this once. "You needn't have." "I wished to." "That is a different thing," she said, taking it, "and I notice you did not deny it." She examined him for a moment with the same frank, unbothered directness she had used on him 3 nights before, and he had the distinct sensation of being read, accurately, by someone who was not remotely trying to flatter him for it. "You've come about the roof the way a man comes about a headache he does not actually have, Mr. Vane, but you're welcome regardless. I've a dispute to settle this afternoon, if you'd care to make yourself useful instead of ornamental." The dispute was between 2 tenant families over a strip of common ground, a matter that had apparently defeated the parish clerk, the vicar, and, though she did not say this aloud, out of some tact he only later appreciated, the estate's own steward. Clementine produced, from a tin box under her bed, the original grant document, 40 years old, foxed at the corners, and read it aloud in the unhurried, precise voice of a woman entirely at home, with old handwriting and older grievances, and settled the matter in 11 minutes with a clarity that made both furious tenants sit down and apologise to each other. Julian watched this happen the way a man watches a conjuring trick he cannot account for. "You read law," he said, when the tenants had gone, considerably more cheerful than they had arrived. "I read documents. There's a difference. Law is what men argue about after they've stopped reading the paper in front of them." She was already tidying the tin box away. "My father kept the parish's letters and reckonings for 30 years, for those who couldn't. I kept doing it after him. It isn't law. It's only patience with paper, and most people haven't the patience, because most people would rather be right than be accurate. Something in him, some small suppressed thing, filed under an entry he had not opened in 3 years, twitched toward the shape of a smile, and was with long practice arrested before it arrived. Nobody saw it. He made certain of that. But it had happened, and somewhere in the servants' hall that evening, though none of them could have said quite how they knew, the general understanding was that Mr. Vane had gone up the lane again, and had come back looking, in the housekeeper's words, like a man who has misplaced something, and is beginning to suspect where. He went back the following week, and the week after, under pretexts that grew steadily thinner, and were received by Clementine with steadily less patience for the pretext, and steadily more patience for the man. He mended her gate latch, badly, and she did not point out that the latch had not in fact been broken before he arrived. He brought her a jar of preserved plums from the hall's own stores, which she accepted with the observation that a land agent's wages did not usually extend to duchy preserved plums. And he said nothing, and she let it go, because some part of her, she would later admit, had already begun choosing not to ask the questions whose answers she suspected she would not like arriving too soon. It was on his 4th visit that she caught the almost smile, or nearly did. She had said something about the goose. Diogenes had taken to following Julian at a respectful distance of exactly 3 feet, an arrangement both parties seemed to have negotiated without her involvement, and something in the timing of her delivery, dry as good sherry, had reached him before his guard did. The corner of his mouth moved. It moved perhaps 1/4 of an inch, and lasted, by her private and unspoken count, somewhere under 2 seconds, before he mastered it and returned his face to its accustomed order. "You very nearly smiled," she said. "I did not. You very nearly did. I saw the beginning of it. It's a shame you called it back. I'd have liked to see how it finished." He did not answer that, because he did not entirely trust what he would say if he tried, and she, watching him not answer, filed the moment away with the quiet satisfaction of a woman keeping a private ledger whose totals were beginning to interest her very much. The pretexts, by the 5th week, had become a kind of shared joke, neither of them named aloud. He arrived with reasons, a fence post, a rumour of poachers, the general welfare of a chimney that had never once given trouble, and she received each one with a raised eyebrow and a chair pulled out regardless, and somewhere between the fence post and the chimney, without either of them declaring it. The visits stopped requiring reasons at all. They fell into Thursdays. Neither of them called it a habit. It became one anyway, the way water becomes a channel, not through any single decision, but through the simple repetition of the same path until the path is the only sensible way to go. It was on a grey Thursday in November, with the rain doing its slow persistent work against her windows, that Clementine mentioned, in passing, that she had gone up to the hall that week to deliver dried herbs to the housekeeper, a standing arrangement of some years, she said, since her father's death, the sort of small trade that kept a village fed and useful to itself, and had, while waiting in the corridor, glimpsed a wing of the house with its shutters closed in full daylight, and a music room with a dust sheet over an instrument that had plainly not been touched in years, and a garden beyond the window given over entirely to grass where the beds had clearly once been roses. A sad house, for all its grandeur, she said, not knowing she was describing, in miniature, the interior life of the man across her table. The Duke, they say, keeps half of it shut up like a tomb. Grief does that, I suppose. Though I've always thought a grieving house ought to be reopened a room at a time. The way you'd air out a sick room, rather than sealed all at once and left to go stale. Julian's cup had gone very still in his hand. "You've an opinion on the Duke's grief," he said carefully, for a woman who's never met him. "I've an opinion on grief generally, Miss, Vane, and I'd hold it whoever the man was." She looked at him, and something in his stillness caught her attention the way a held breath catches a listener's ear, though she could not yet have said why. "You go quiet when I mention him." "He is not," Julian said, "an easy man to speak of." "No," she agreed, gently, mistaking the cause of his quiet for simple loyalty. "A steward's discretion about his master, I don't suppose he is." And she let it rest there, and refilled his cup from the pot, and did not press. And he sat in her small warm kitchen, with her grandmother's blanket still folded on the shelf where she kept it for him, she had begun, without remarking on it. Keeping it for him, feeling the particular vertigo of a man being seen with perfect accuracy by someone who did not yet know what, exactly, she was seeing. Her own grief, when it surfaced that same afternoon, arrived without ceremony, the way true griefs generally do. She told him, because he had asked, gently, why a woman of her evident capability lived alone at the edge of an estate, mending other people's hems, that her father had died 4 winters past, and her mother before that, and that she had considered, briefly, in the black months after, whether joy was a thing she still had any right to. "I decided it was," she said, "because the alternative seemed like handing the world one more victory it hadn't earned. Grief takes enough. I wasn't inclined to let it have my laugh as well. That is not a small thing to decide." "No," she agreed. "It took some deciding. I don't recommend arriving at it quickly. I don't think it counts. If you do." She smiled at him. The plain, unguarded smile that had first undone him by a hedge in the rain. "But I'd rather laugh at my own misfortunes than let them stand there unmocked. They're less frightening, laughed at. Try it sometime, Mr. Vane. You look like a man who hasn't in years." He did not answer that either. But he thought about it, walking home in the rain that had not once, in 5 weeks, managed to dampen anything about her, and he thought about the sealed wing, and the dust-sheeted piano, and the garden gone to grass, and understood for the first time with any real clarity that he had been living in a house arranged like a monument, and that a woman with a chipped blue teacup and an opinionated goose had just described his own life back to him without knowing it was his. The rain that had haunted Julian Ashford's autumn arrived in force again on a Tuesday in late November, trapping him at Larkspur Cottage, for that was the name Clementine's father had given it, after the flowers that would not, this late in the year, grow anywhere near it, for the better part of an afternoon that neither of them would afterward describe as an inconvenience. It began as weather, and became by slow degrees a confession. "You're very good at not answering questions," she said, watching the rain lash the small window while she mended by the fire the tin box of the estate's tenant papers, for she had begun, at his quiet urging, helping him settle several such disputes he claimed on behalf of the estate office, closed on the table between them. "I've noticed it for weeks. You answer around things. You answer the shape of a question and leave the middle of it empty. It is a habit acquired in service to a household that prefers discretion. That is an answer around a question," she said, in service to demonstrating my point. She set down her mending. "I don't ask to trap you, Mr. Vane. I ask because I find I would like to know you, and I keep arriving at the edge of a wall instead." He looked at the fire for a long moment, and when he spoke his sentences did something they had not done in her company before. They broke, mid-thought, and started again, the way a man's sentences break when he is building them without a plan and discovering too late that the plan matters. "I was married," he said. 3 years ago, a little more now, I lost my wife. Her name was Marguerite. She played the piano rather badly and rather often, and I did not appreciate, while she was alive, how much I would miss the badness of it particularly. Because bad playing done with love is a different thing from silence, and I have had a great deal of silence since, and none of it has once sounded like her. Clementine did not say she was sorry, because she had learned in her own grief how little that particular sentence accomplishes. She said, instead, what was the last thing she played? It was the correct question, though she could not have explained how she knew it, and something in Julian's chest that had been braced for sympathy, and had a well-rehearsed defence against sympathy, had no defence at all prepared for that. A country air. Badly. I laughed at her that last morning over how badly, and she threw a cushion at me. "And I have not," he said. And here the sentence broke again, properly this time. I have not laughed like that since, not once. 3 years, Clementine, I had begun to think the capacity for it had gone into the ground with her. It was the first time he had used her name without the barrier of Mr. Vane's careful distance, and she heard it land the way a stone lands in still water, all the way to the bottom. "You still haven't told me your name," she said gently, "the real one." "No," he admitted, "I haven't. I think I have begun to suspect it anyway." He looked at her then, fully, the way he had not quite allowed himself to before, and something in his face, some long-locked door, opened by perhaps an inch, and what came through it was not a smile exactly, not yet, but its nearer cousin, a softening around the eyes, a stillness that was not the stillness of a man holding himself in check, but the stillness of a man, briefly, unguarded. Clementine, watching it happen, felt something in her own chest answer it, unbidden, and did not try to talk herself out of the feeling, because she had never been in the habit of talking herself out of true things. "I would rather you heard it from me than guessed it from a servant," he said. but I find I am a coward about the exact moment, which is a new experience for me, and not a comfortable one. Then don't tell me today, she said. Tell me when you're ready, and I promise to be exactly as unimpressed as I have been about everything else. She smiled, and this time it reached him fully, and the almost smile he gave back lasted. By her count, she had, without meaning to, become a woman who counted such things. Nearly 4 full seconds, the longest yet, before it retreated to its usual careful half-inch. The blue cup sat between them on the table, refilled twice that afternoon, and when the rain finally eased toward evening he took his leave, with the small, unremarkable gesture of taking the cup itself with him. To return it properly washed, he said, an excuse so thin they both heard it for what it was. A reason to keep something of hers a little longer, and she let him, because she understood by then precisely what was being asked, even unspoken. She learned his name 3 days later, not from him, but from the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, who arrived at Larkspur Cottage in a carriage entirely too grand for the lane it travelled, stepped down without assistance at the age of 71, and said, by way of introduction, "You are the young woman my grandson has been visiting under an assumed name for 2 months, and I have come to see whether you are a fool, a fortune hunter, or the first sensible thing that has happened to this family since his wedding." Clementine, who had been up to her elbows in bread flour, set down her bowl with the composure of a woman determined not to let flour or shock get the better of her, and said, "I don't yet know which of those I am, Your Grace, since I only learned the shape of the question a moment ago. Would you care to come in and help me decide over tea?" The Dowager Duchess, whose name was Ottoline, and whose opinion of most people had calcified decades before into a permanent and well-earned scepticism, looked at her for a long moment with the frank appraising eye of a woman who had buried a husband, outlived 2 fashions in bonnets, and developed no patience whatsoever for being managed. "Yes," she said, "I would." She stayed an hour, drank 3 cups of tea from Clementine's ordinary crockery without complaint, and asked in the course of that hour precisely 11 questions, each one sharper than the last, about Clementine's father, her income, her intentions, her opinion of the tenant boundary dispute Julian had mentioned with what the Duchess called suspicious enthusiasm, and, delivered without warning, the way a good interrogator saves her best question for when the subject has relaxed, what Clementine intended to do about the fact that her grandson had not laughed, truly laughed, since his wife died, and appeared, on recent evidence gathered by no fewer than 4 members of the household staff, to be dangerously close to remembering how. "I don't intend to do anything about it," Clementine said, beyond continuing to be exactly the person he keeps returning to see. "I've no talent for management, Your Grace, and I distrust anyone who claims to manage another person's grief on purpose. I only mean to keep being honest with him, and let him arrive at whatever he arrives at in his own time." It was, the Dowager Duchess reflected afterward, riding home in her 2 grand carriage with an expression her own coachman had not seen in a decade, exactly the correct answer, and very likely the only one that would have satisfied her. Julian came the following Thursday to find Clementine waiting for him at the gate rather than in the kitchen, arms crossed, an expression on her face that was not anger, quite, but was clearly its close relation. "Your grandmother came to inspect me," she said, "and I believe I passed, though she gave no indication of the mark. Your Grace." He stopped walking. Diogenes, sensing weather in the air of an entirely different kind than rain, positioned himself at a diplomatic distance and watched with professional interest. "I should have told you myself," Julian said. "I have been telling myself for 3 weeks that I would, and each week I found a reason it wasn't yet the moment. And I understand now that there was never going to be a moment that felt safe, because I was afraid, and here the sentence did what his sentences did when the truth in them outran his composure. It broke and started over. I was afraid that the man you liked was Mr. Vane, and that the Duke would arrive and displace him, and you would find you preferred the fiction. That," Clementine said, "is the single most foolish thing you have said to me in 2 months, and you have said several foolish things, mostly about roofs that did not need inspecting." Something in her face eased then, the anger draining out of it, the way weather drains from a sky once the rain has actually fallen. "I did not fall for a name. Julian Ashford. I fell for a man who folded a blanket properly before returning it, and let a goose bite his boot without complaint, and asked me what the last song was rather than telling me he was sorry. The title is only a coat you're wearing over the same man. I find I don't mind the coat. I only minded not being told whose it was." He crossed the distance between them and took her hands, the first time he had done so with any deliberateness, rather than the accidental brush of passing a cup, and stood there in the grey November light saying nothing at all, because for once nothing needed saying. And Diogenes, satisfied that the weather had passed, went back to his water butt entirely unbothered. The trouble, when it came, arrived by post, which the household of Ashford Hall had long ago learned to regard with suspicion, since trouble in a house of that kind rarely announced itself in person, when a letter could do the work instead. The letter came from a Mr. Reginald Pell, a second cousin of Julian's on his father's side, a man whose relationship to the family had always been cordial in the specific way that cordiality curdles when there is money nearby to disagree about. Mr. Pell's farm bordered the eastern edge of the estate, adjoining, by an inconvenient accident of old surveying, the very strip of common ground Clementine had settled between 2 tenant families some weeks before. Mr. Pell had recently discovered, he wrote, that the boundary as commonly understood did not match a much older survey in his possession, one that placed a further 11 acres, Larkspur Cottage's own garden and orchard among them, squarely within his claim rather than the Duke's. He proposed, in tones of injured reasonableness, that the matter be settled quickly and quietly, before it became necessary to involve the courts, and hoped his cousin the Duke would see the sense of a private arrangement. "He wants the cottage," Clementine said, reading the letter over Julian's shoulder in the estate office, her voice steady in the particular way of a person keeping herself steady on purpose. "Or near enough. He wants what's under it. He will not have it," Julian said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet and very final, the tone of a man who did paperwork the way other men fought duels. "But he has chosen his moment cleverly. My grandmother is to hold her annual dinner for the county in a fortnight, and half the families whose good opinion matters to Pell's ambitions will be under this roof. He means to press the claim publicly, where withdrawing would cost him nothing, and pressing it might cost me everything, if I am not careful in how I answer it." What Clementine did not learn until some days later, because Julian, in a habit she would come to recognise as entirely characteristic of him, did his kindnesses in the manner of a man committing a small crime, and hoping not to be caught, was that he had, that same week, quietly instructed his solicitor to renew, in perpetuity and at no increase in rent. The lease on Larkspur Cottage in Clementine's name alone, regardless of what became of him, or her, or any claim Reginald Pell might advance, so that whatever else the coming fortnight cost either of them, She would not lose her father's roof over it. He told no one but the solicitor, and, unavoidably, Fenwick, who received the instruction with the particular stillness of a man filing away one more piece of evidence in a case he had long ago decided was closed. The Dowager Duchess, informed of the situation over a dinner she had specifically arranged to discuss it, set down her fork with the crisp finality of a woman closing an account book. "Then we shall settle it at the dinner itself," she said, "in front of precisely the audience Mr. Pell intends to use against you, and we shall do it with paper, not temper. Because temper is what he is hoping for, and paper is what will actually win. Clementine, you read old documents better than any clerk in the county. I want you at that dinner, not hidden in the kitchen wing pretending to be nobody's concern. At the table. Your Grace, I am not received in society, and a woman who mends hymns for a living is exactly the woman who will be sitting at my right hand in a fortnight," Ottoline said, "because I have decided it, and I am 71 years old, and past caring whom that offends. I did not survive 2 duchesses' worth of scandal in my own youth to be lectured now about propriety by Reginald Pell's tedious little claim." She looked at Clementine over her spectacles with an expression that was, for the first time, something close to fond. "You settled a boundary dispute in 11 minutes that had defeated my grandson's own steward for a year. I imagine you can manage one cousin." The dinner arrived with the particular dread of an appointment too long anticipated. Clementine wore a gown that was not fashionable and did not pretend to be, and stood at Ottoline's right hand as instructed, and when Reginald Pell rose after the second course to make, with elaborate regret, his case before an audience of 40 of the county's better families. She listened to every word of it with the stillness of a woman waiting for the one mistake that would undo him. It came in the 3rd minute. Pell, warming to his own performance, cited the old survey by date, and by the name of the surveyor who had drawn it, a Mr. Aldous Crane, in the year of the old king's illness, and Clementine, who had spent 4 winters of her life reading exactly this class of document for people who could not read it themselves, felt something click into place with the quiet satisfaction of a key finding its lock. "Forgive me," she said, standing, into a silence that had not expected her to speak at all, but Mr. Crane never surveyed east of the ford. "I have his ledger. My father kept the parish's old papers, and Mr. Crane's own hand states, in his entry for that year, that the eastern boundary was surveyed instead by his apprentice, a Mr. Wicks, whose measurements were disputed and formally superseded the following spring by the survey the estate currently holds. If Mr. Pell has a document bearing Mr. Crane's name for that stretch of ground, I would be very glad to see it, because either a great man's records are wrong, or the document Mr. Pell is holding is not what he believes it to be." The silence that followed had a different quality to it than the one before, and Reginald Pell, who had built his case on a signature he had never troubled to verify, went the colour of old paper himself. Ottoline delivered the verdict with the crisp, merciless courtesy of a woman who had waited her whole life to enjoy a moment exactly like this one. "I believe," she said into the hush, "that Mr. Pell will wish to withdraw his claim before dessert, so that we may all enjoy the pudding without further discussion of surveyors. And I believe," she added, turning to Clementine with an expression the entire table would discuss for a fortnight afterward, "that this young woman has just demonstrated more competence in 10 minutes than half the barristers of my acquaintance manage in a career, and I should like it recorded that I said so first." No one saw Mr. Pell leave the table before the pudding was served. He simply was not there when it arrived, which he would have minded most of all had anyone troubled to notice. The victory, however, brought its own quiet cost, because Julian, watching Clementine hold that room with a composure he had never once managed to fake in 3 years of trying, felt something old and frightened stir in him alongside the pride. The specific fear of a man who has already lost one remarkable woman and cannot quite believe his fortune in finding a second, and distrusts good fortune on principle, the way a man who has been struck by lightning eyes a clear sky. He grew quiet in the days that followed. He buried himself in a state business that did not need him, and Clementine, sensing the retreat without yet understanding its shape, buried herself in her mending, and told herself, with the same discipline she had once turned to her own grief, that some things could not be rushed, only waited out. Julian rode to Larkspur Cottage on a morning in early December that had turned, overnight, properly cold, the first true frost of the year lying white and exact across every hedge along the lane, and he rode it the way a man rides when he has finally stopped arguing with himself. He had spent the better part of a week doing exactly that arguing, alone in the estate office with ledgers he did not need to check, and had arrived by slow and reluctant degrees at a conclusion his grandmother could have told him in an afternoon, and had, in fact, told him twice already, that the fear of losing a second remarkable woman was not a reason to withhold himself from the first honest happiness he had been offered in 3 years, but merely the oldest excuse grief knows for keeping a man small. Fenwick had said nothing at all about the matter, which had, as ever, said everything. Clementine was at her gate when he arrived, not because she had been waiting for him exactly, though she had been waiting for him in the way one waits for whether one has begun, cautiously, to hope for. "You've been scarce," she said, for a man who claimed to have run out of pretexts. "I have been a coward," Julian said, dismounting, in a manner I find considerably more difficult to forgive in myself than the cowardice of not giving my name. "I watched you take that room apart with 11 minutes and an old ledger, and instead of simply admiring you for it, some frightened part of me went looking for reasons it couldn't last, because the last time I loved a woman who filled a room like that, I lost her, and some superstitious animal part of my mind has apparently decided that loving you properly is a debt it will one day be asked to repay." "That is a great deal of reasoning," Clementine said, "for a man standing at my gate in the cold instead of coming in for tea." "I don't want tea," he said. "I want to say this properly, and I find I am no good at saying things properly, so I will simply say them badly and trust you to hear what I mean underneath." She waited. Diogenes, sensing the gravity of the moment with an instinct that had, over 2 months, become genuinely reliable, came and stood beside her without comment, which was, from Diogenes, a form of blessing. "Because you moved the beehives without asking, the week after the frost, and saved them, and never once mentioned it until I noticed myself," Julian said. "And because you read my grandmother in 11 minutes and did not flinch, and because the goose trusts you more than he has ever trusted me, and I find that matters to me more than it has any right to, because you asked what the last song was, instead of telling me you were sorry, and no one, not one person in 3 years, had thought to ask me that instead. Because the library at the hall has been unbearable to sit in on Tuesdays, which was the day she used to read there, and it has been unbearable in exactly the same way every Tuesday since I met you, except that now I find I want to tell you that, rather than simply endure it alone, which is the thing I have been doing badly for 3 years, and would like very much to stop doing." He stopped. He had clearly meant to go on. "I am doing this badly," he said instead. "You are doing it exactly right," Clementine said. and something in her voice had gone soft in a way it rarely did, though she kept the rest of her steady, because steadiness was the gift she had to give him, and she meant to give it fully. "Ask me properly, Julian. I find I have been waiting for it rather longer than I meant to admit. Marry me," he said. "I have made a very poor case for it, itemised badly, and I have no doubt my grandmother will tell you I left out the best parts. You left out nothing that mattered." She took his cold hands in her own, and looked at him with the same unafraid directness that had undone him in the first place, by a hedge, in the rain, months before. Yes, obviously yes, what happened in Julian Ashford's chest in the next several seconds was not, strictly, describable by any observer, because there was no observer. Only Clementine and a goose and a white frost holding perfectly still across the lane. But the laugh that came out of him then was not the careful, half-inch, arrested thing that had escaped him twice before, and been called swiftly back. It came out whole. It came out the way a held breath comes out, all at once, with nothing left in reserve, and it went on, Clementine, laughing herself now, could not help but count it, old habit, for very nearly 11 full seconds, the longest sound of unguarded joy that Cottage Lane had heard in 3 years, and Diogenes, startled by the noise, honked once in what might charitably have been called accompaniment, and neither of them minded in the least. The 2-word treatise came quickly after that, in the manner of people who have already done the hard work of honesty, and find the rest arranges itself with surprising ease. "The goose comes with me," Clementine said, into his shoulder, still laughing. "That is non-negotiable." "Agreed," Julian said. "And the roses," he added, before she could ask, "will be replanted before the wedding, whether or not they've any hope of blooming by then, because I find I no longer wish to look at grass where a garden ought to be." "Agreed," said Clementine, and that, more or less, settled everything that mattered. The wedding itself, when it came in the 2nd week of December, was a small affair by the standards of dukedoms, and an enormous one by the standards of Larkspur Lane, held in the parish church with its stones still holding the frost's chill, and it was over, by the vicar's own later account, in considerably less time than his sermon had taken to write, because neither bride nor groom saw any reason to prolong what they had already settled between themselves at a gate in the cold. Diogenes, brought along at Clementine's insistence over the vicar's objection, conducted himself with all the decorum his species allows, which is to say none whatsoever, and honked twice during the vows in a manner the Dowager Duchess later described, with visible satisfaction, as entirely appropriate commentary. Ottoline wept, briefly and without apology, into a handkerchief she had clearly brought for the purpose, and told anyone who asked that she was merely troubled by the cold, a claim believed by absolutely no one. Spring came properly to Ashford that year, and it came, as it always eventually does, room by room. The east wing's shutters were the first to open, on a morning in April when Clementine simply asked, without ceremony, whether they might, and Julian, who had spent 3 years treating the question as unaskable, found he had no answer against her but yes. The dust-sheet came off the piano the same week, and though Clementine could not play it half so well as its former mistress, she played it badly and often, in exactly the spirit that Julian had once described to her by a fire, and he found, to his own quiet astonishment, reported faithfully to Fenwick, who received it with the particular stillness of a man who had known it was coming for months. That badly played music, done with love, was precisely the sound he had been missing, and not, as he had feared, a betrayal of the woman who had first taught him to love it. The garden took longer, because roses are not persuaded by wishing, but by June the beds along the south wall held their first uncertain green, and by the following spring, the nomic close of this particular story being, as ever, a little further out than the wedding itself. They bloomed in the exact shade of pink that Marguerite had once favoured, planted deliberately so, at Clementine's own quiet insistence, because she had never once believed that loving Julian required unloving the woman who came before her, only that the garden, like the house, like the man, had room enough for both. The smile arrived the same way. By the first spring of their marriage, those who kept count, and the household by long habit still kept count, though the ledger had long since stopped being one of deficit, reported that the Duke smiled most mornings over breakfast, occasionally before his tea had even cooled, and laughed properly at least twice a week, usually at something the goose had done. Or something Clementine had said about the goose, which amounted to much the same thing. Fenwick's left eyebrow, retired at last from its long vigil, was observed to relax into an expression the housekeeper called, with evident relief, ordinary. Reginald Pell was not seen again at Ashford, having removed himself to a distant county shortly after the dinner that undid him, and no one troubled to miss him, which he would have minded most of all, had he ever troubled to ask. The blue cup, chipped that first night by the fire and never once replaced, sat on the mantel of the Duke's own private study thereafter, no longer poured from, its status settled and its arc complete, the first thing she had ever put into his hands, and the first thing, therefore, that Ashford Hall's staff quietly agreed no one was ever to be permitted to throw away. Diogenes lived to a scandalous old age, outlasting 3 under-gardeners, and one entire hedge he had personally destroyed out of what could only be described as professional jealousy, and was, by all household accounts, buried at his own considerable insistence beneath the very roses he had spent his final years guarding. There are stories that begin with a stranger shivering at a cottage door in the rain, mistaken for nobody in particular. This one ended with a garden in bloom, a badly played piano, and a Duke who could no longer remember, some mornings, why he had ever thought a smile was something to be rationed. Attention, it turns out, is the beginning of love, and accuracy is the whole of it thereafter. Certainty was never required to plant a garden, only the willingness to water what you had put in the ground, and trust, against all the evidence of a colder season, that it meant to come up green.